So for this week, we kind of learned about learning. And so for mine, I did option number one. I kind of just talked about the different types of learning and their components and what are examples of them. And I actually thought that I thought this week was super interesting, and like all three of the learning concepts like made sense to me, and I could see how like those different times happened throughout my life. And so the first one is classical conditioning. And classical conditioning is like where you learn to associate the stimuli with like an anticipated event. And so an example that they like kind of gave for that was so lightning will like flash across the sky, and then a couple seconds later like the thunder will like boom, and then you'll like jump when the thunder like booms, and then you'll learn to associate lightning with the thunder, so when the lightning flashes, then like you'll also jump like when the lightning flashes, because you associate like the lightning flashing with the thunder with you jumping, if that makes any sense. And so in parts of classical conditioning, there's the unconditioned stimulus, which is a stimulus that gets a reflexive response from an organism without like being learned. It's just like a reflex, like a natural. And an unconditioned response is a natural unlearned response to a stimulus. Like if you're like touching something hot, like that unconditioned response, that would be an unconditioned response. A conditioned stimulus is a stimulus that gets a response after being repeatedly paired with an unconditioned stimulus. An example that they gave, first I'll tell you about a conditioned response, and then I'll tell you about the example. A conditioned response is the behavior caused by the conditioned stimulus. And then a neutral stimulus is something that like doesn't have to do with anything, but a neutral stimulus can become a conditioned stimulus. And so the example that they used was they had a dog, and every time like they would put the food out, the dog would salivate. And so the food is the unconditioned stimulus, salivating is an unconditioned response. And so they would start to ring a bell right before they would give the food, and so the bell ringing would be the neutral stimulus, and then they would give the dog the food every time. And so it started to become so where the bell would ring, the dog would salivate. And so the bell becomes the conditioned stimulus, and the dog salivating at the sound of the bell is the conditioned response. And so that's classical conditioning. And then the next one is operant conditioning, and it's where you associate a behavior with a consequence. And so there's positive reinforcement, which is there's like reinforcement and punishment, and there's positive and negative of both of them. And so positive reinforcement is when you add something to increase the likelihood of a behavior. Negative reinforcement is when you remove something to increase the likelihood of behavior. Positive punishment is when you add something to decrease the likelihood of a behavior, and negative punishment is when you remove something to decrease the likelihood of behavior. And so like positive reinforcement would be if you like give a dog a treat after they like sit, that's a positive reinforcement because you're adding something to increase the likelihood of the behavior. And negative reinforcement would be if like you took away if you took away something so that it will increase the likelihood of behavior. And then positive punishment is when like you reprimand someone, so you add the stimulus, which is a reprimand, and to decrease the likelihood of them doing that again. And a negative punishment would be to like take something away, like take away something that they like, to decrease the likelihood of that behavior happening again. And so a lot of times with this, people do like shaping, not people, but like shaping is a part of this. And it's where you reinforce any responses that resemble the desired behavior, because a lot of the time you're not automatically going to get the behavior that you want. So you slowly just reinforce anything that's closer to the behavior that you want, and then eventually like you'll get the desired behavior. And so part of this, there's primary reinforcers and secondary reinforcers. Primary reinforcers are not learned. So like it's like your necessities, like food, water, like like things like that. And then secondary reinforcers don't have any value unless linked to a primary reinforcer, like money is what they use, because money in itself doesn't have any value unless you use that money to like buy food, clothes, water, things like that, you know? Then there's observational learning, and it's learning by watching and then imitating or modeling what they do or say. And so the model is the person who's acting as the example. And there's vicarious punishment, and so it's where the observer sees the model being punished, so they're less likely to imitate the model's behavior. And then there's vicarious reinforcement, where the observer sees the model rewarded, so they're more likely to imitate the model's behavior. And so an example of classical conditioning is where my brother is the only one who feeds my dog in the afternoon, and so whenever he sees Kevin and it's close to afternoon, he'll start going crazy, like, because he just wants to be fed. And so he associates Kevin with being fed. And then an example of operant conditioning is whenever I would get an A in like school, my parents would give me $5. So it would like, so they're doing positive reinforcement, and it made me try harder to get those A's so that I could get that money. And then an example of observational learning is when like I work at Plato's Closet, and when I learned how to give how to give people back the clothes that they've brought in, and I tell them about them, I kind of learned how to do that by watching the other people, and then like I just imitated what they would do. I thought this was a super interesting activity to kind of see the different ways that we learn, and it kind of really made sense to me. And I think it can just help you recognize that you're like learning while you're doing it, by knowing this. And my question is, how do you, like, what type of learning do you most use in your life? And, like, what are like the different parts of it, an example of it? And so, yeah, I hope you enjoyed it.